Venetian Italian to get the full force of her language. So in my translations, which I provide some translations here, I tried to keep the flavor and the impact of the writer's original words. Right? Okay, abandoned daughter. A Venetian nun wages war, and this is the story of Arcangela Tarabotti. Forced monetization, which is forcing a girl to become a nun, was of patrician daughters, that is, noble, upper-class daughters, during the Renaissance in Catholic Europe, became common practice among the upper-class and patrician families, committed to endogamous marriages, and endogamous would mean marriages within the same class, all right? Within the same social class, and constrained by the dowry system. The dowry was the portion, the bride's portion that she would bring to the marriage. Particularly in Venice, La Serenissima Repubblica, a city striving to maintain what had become a hereditary oligarchy, we see in the 150 years leading up to the 17th century, we're in the 17th century now, that is the 1600s, a steady increase in the number of nuns enclosed in the 39 convents of the city. By 1642, Venice would boast of having nearly 3,000 nuns in a city that numbered 2,250 patrician women total, more or less. An astounding 85% of them were nuns, most of whom took the veil by force, having no religious vocation. The economic, cultural, and social dictates of the late Middle Ages through the early modern period and well into the 19th century gave rise to convents that were basically receptacles for unwanted daughters, surplus girls. Those who entered against their will lived out their lives within the convent walls, with little or no recourse to ever change their plight. For these girls whose lives, from childhood until death, were to be spent in monastic institutions, convents were earthly infernos, creating for the cloistered girls and women devoid of religious calling a living death. Elena Cassandra Tarabotti, one such child, would become Arcangela Tarabotti, who, through her scathing texts, denounced the contemporary practice of involuntary monetization, involuntarily committing young girls to the convent. Metaphorically scaling the convent walls through her excoriating and subversive condemnation of what she herself termed the sacrilegious, inhuman treatment of innocents. Arcangela Tarabotti decried the patriarchal powers that defined family, state, and church responsible for the practice of committing unwilling girls to a life of claustration. Tarabotti's story takes place in 17th century Venice, that's the 1600s, which was still, even after intermittent waves of bubonic plague, one of Europe's most populated cities. Although Venetians were proud of their republic, by this time having survived the combined armies of Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and of the papacy, Venice was no longer the greatest European maritime force. Venetians could look around them, and they could see the peninsula, the Italian peninsula, coming under control of Spain, the looming blight of foreign occupation. Venetian rulers were determined to keep Venice, La Serenissima Repubblica, independent, as it had been for a millennium, and to keep alive the myth of Venice. The myth of Venice centered on the city's reputation for its political and social stability, attributed to its divine favor and exceptional governing by its patriciate, the noble class. The most serene republic, crisscrossed by hundreds of canals, protected on all sides by water, and proud of its longevity as a republic, owed its stability to a particularly rigid social stratification that reinforced and maintained a secure political environment. With centuries-old history of peace and power, Venice relied on its resistance system of varied levels of fixed social order, dominated at every rung by a patriarchal power. At the highest rung of the ladder was the patrician class, adult males who sat on the Great Council and could hold public office. This was a hereditary caste of about 200 families and clans. Some members were very rich, and others without a ducat or a penny. Right? Some members, all of them, however, could boast of ancestry dating back to the 13th century. At the head of this constitutional monarchy was the Venetian doge, who ruled for life, living lavishly, passing laws in his name, although his powers were limited by the Great Council. The Council of Ten actually held the supreme power. The Venetian Patriarch, a title given to the Bishop of Venice, was head of the Roman Catholic Church in the Venetian Republic, and this title still exists, the position still exists today. The cittadini, or citizens, were directly below the aristocracy. They were full citizens whose lineage did not go as far back as the patrician class. They couldn't trace it back to the 13th century. Last were the popolani, that is the populace, incorporating most Venetians, from the very poor, even to the well-to-do shopkeepers, artisans, having all the rights of citizenship, including limited access to some governmental positions, although they could not vote. This class typically concurred with the ruling class. The Council of Ten, this is really interesting, in 1506 passed a law requiring all noble births to be recorded in the Libro d'Oro, that is the Golden Book. That would ensure the propagation of the Council of Ten by keeping the patriciate, the noble class, pure, a consideration deemed essential for the peace and prosperity of Venice. In order to guarantee that male babies were born of noble women, the registry included the surname and birthplace of the mother as well. Therefore, women born of noble families were of high value to the patriciate to maintain the peace, unity, and stability. Proper marriages were essential to the well-being of the state. And the Libro d'Oro, the registry of noble bloodlines, provided this legal documentation. Into this social milieu and political milieu was born Elena Cassandra Tarabotti in 1604. She was the fourth child and first daughter of Stefano and Maria Tarabotti, both belonging to well-to-do Venetian families. Two of the boys died, probably in early childhood, and 6 more girls were to be born, the last daughter in 1617. The family was prevalently female, a rather sad state, especially for Elena, the oldest girl and only daughter to be put in the convent. We learned from Tarabotti's writings that she was slightly zoppa, like her father, citing her limp as reason she was deemed unmarriageable and destined for monastic life. It was common practice for families to monachinize the older daughters, reserving patrimony and lineage for the male heir, and perhaps chosen daughters, depending on the family circumstances. Stefano Tarabotti placed his unwilling 11-year-old daughter in the close-by Benedictine convent of Sant'Anna, within walking distance from the Tarabotti home in the Castello neighborhood of Venice. She was sent to Sant'Anna as a student boarder, or in Italian it would be the educanda, where she would receive room and board, rudimentary education, reading, writing, embroidery, lace making. This type of education at the start of the 17th century was actually a sign that the family had arrived, and depending on the convent, often a prestigious social commentary. Boarding young girls also served another purpose. It was a sort of seminary for future nuns, voluntary or not. Some girls would return to their families and marry, and others, like Elena, would remain cloistered for the rest of their lives. At age 16, Elena took her first vows, and in 1623, 3 years later, her final vows. In her book, Convent Hell, in Italian it's Inferno Monacale, right, which was published after her death. It was published during her lifetime, 2 years after her death this was published. She describes part of the process, and this is not, it's not available in English. So this is my translation. She describes part of the process of an involuntary girl becoming a nun. This funeral celebration is hardly distinguishable from the actual funerals for the dead. The girl lies prostrate, mouth to the stone floor. A black cloth is then thrown over her head, and one burning candle is placed at her feet, another placed near her head. From above, the litany is sung. All indications would suggest the girl is dead. She herself feels she is attending her own funeral. In her Inferno Monacale, that's Convent Hell, a tome that the nun most likely wrote in the early years of her clausura, you really can't help, when you read it, to notice the vocabulary of violence. Violence perpetrated by the powerful upon the innocent, driving Arcangela to write about the miserable, unfortunate creatures who were born into the light of day only to live from their innocent state until their deaths in prisons. In Tyrannia Paterna, that is paternal tyranny, another of her texts published 2 years after her death, not during her lifetime, believed to have been penned in her late teens, again at the very beginning of her enclosure in the convent, we note the still open wounds of a young novice, referring to her consorelle as donne imprigionate con violenza, women violently imprisoned. We find cognates of the word crudele, cruel, and castigo, punishment, appear no less than 75 times in the 150-page invective against tyrannical forces. Arcangela commiserates the unhappy Hebrews. Not quite. There. She commiserates the unhappy Hebrews, conquered and exiled from their homeland. Lo stesso avviene all'infelice Monica. She says the same thing happens to the unhappy nuns, the unhappy sisters, the unhappy nuns. While we cry over our servile state and our lost freedom, ci troviamo in terra aliena. We find ourselves in this alien world inhabited by violently imprisoned women. Many of her words could equally describe a physical bodily rape which cast these innocents into an inferno. She writes, rather than being clothed in religious garments, they are wrapped in chains in the Stygian swamp of a monastery, in which they are condemned to subservience and submission to the will of others. Venetian society on all levels strictly adhered to endogamous marriages, that is, marrying within one social class, a practice especially pertinent to our discussion of enforced monetization. Indeed, marrying outside of one's rank and had legal consequences, limiting or prohibiting possibilities of holding office, of holding public office, for contemporary and future generations. Since, from the start of the 16th century, as we saw, all noble marriages were recorded in the Libro d'Oro, the state could ensure pure bloodlines to preserve patrilineage heredity, a status which relied on preventing patrician girls from marrying down, forming unequal alliances. To this end, convents played an essential role in providing a dignified, often prestigious place to deposit excess daughters. Too many daughters stretched thin family resources as patricians contended for the best possible marriage for their female offspring, the achievement of which depended upon the amount of the dowry, the bride's portion contractually and mutually agreed upon by the families of both bride and groom. Dowry amounts had been steadily increasing for centuries, not only in Venice, making it a more and more expensive proposition for a girl to marry well, which was a circumstance that offered many perks to the family. Having an eminent brother-in-law, for example, could secure the bride's male siblings prestigious connections. Indeed, the entire family would reap benefits as well as would reap the benefits of a well-married sister, a well-married niece, a well-married daughter, whereas a mismatch would have the opposite effect, resulting in loss of the family's honor and regard, and lowering its standing in the community and its opportunities. The popular saying, maritare o monecare, that is, marriage or the convent, couldn't be more true for patrician daughters, with the third choice, allowing unmarried girls to remain at home, anathema to fathers and family. Keeping at home unmarried daughters after the age of puberty, with no prospects for an equally matched marriage, presented social problems which were to be avoided at all costs. With so much at stake, daughters' desires were of little consequence, to the point of cloistering them at a lesser price than required for a dowry. The spiritual dowry, as we call it, was usually less than the marital dowry. The reality of escalating dowries did corner patrician families, constricted by equal marriage matches, into a position leaving them with no choice but to cloister their offspring. And I say it with a question, because I'm going to try to answer that. Exacerbating the situation was social acceptance, often encouragement of bachelorhood, resulting in a restricted pool of eligible husbands. With limited or no prospects to find equal or better earthly mates for all daughters, fathers turned to convents to secure an acceptable alternative. But be that as it may, let us keep in mind that the dowry system, a practice dating back to antiquity, was culturally determined and socially constructed and sustained. How fathers and family managed their expenses was subjective. The Venetian aristocracy and upper classes, entrenched for centuries within the dowry system and committed to endogamous marriages, continued to offer higher and higher prices to have their daughters marry equals or better. in spite of ecclesiastic and state authorities who, in fear of impoverishing the very nobles that control the state and nurture its independence and stability, attempted in vain to cap the dowry amounts through legislation. Nobles, however, continued to compete, upping the ante, resulting in excessive rates of the marriage portion. Status, greed, hypocrisy. Tarabotti alludes to the chivious lives fathers often lived. Self-interest arguably informed the father's choice to compel unwilling girls to become professed religious. Complicit in thought and action, family, church, and state upheld the necessity of convents as warehouses for daughters, placing the greater good, as they saw it, the stability of the state, above the will of young females. In a society that frowned on social change, rigid in its class hierarchy, family, church, and state, cognizant of the suffering inflicted on these innocents, had too much to lose to allow the treatment of girls to override considerations of patrimony, power, and permanence. Arcangela Tarabotti reveals... Yes,
was that slide, was that an indication of hanky-panky going on with the nun?
Was it? Well, yes, and I can answer those questions later. I don't address that, but of course, with these constrictions, yes, you have girls involuntary cloistered, sure.
I just say hanky-panky in the title.
Hanky-panky. No. Okay.
I deserved it.
Anyway, Arcangela Tarabotti, this is in the original Italian. No, actually, this is Zanet wrote, is her only biographer. Again, he's not translated into English, and he wrote in 1965. So this is 1965 Venetian Italian. It's a little better. Okay, Arcangela Tarabotti reveals no secrets when she claims it was common knowledge in Venice that most of the noble and patrician girls, except perhaps the last-born female, were systematically disposed of to the convent by their fathers in order to preserve the family patrimony, especially for the firstborn male. The social necessity of confining surplus girls trumped any moral or religious argument. In fact, we have a letter, this is part of the letter, from the Venetian patriarch, that is the Bishop of Venice, Giovanni Tiepolo, who was patriarch from 1619 to 1631, which shows his awareness and understanding of the practice of forced monetization, acknowledging how this system sacrifices women. Si sono confinati fra quella mura, non per spirito di devozione, ma per impulso di loro. In this letter, written to the Doge and the Venetian Senate, Tiepolo acknowledges that these girls are made to take the veil not by their own accord, and that they're deprived of their liberty, which is a gift of God. He calls their living quarters, this is what he's calling them, tiny little ovens of cells in which their lives are cooked, passing the time in tears and sighs. Nonetheless, Patriarch Tiepolo goes on to defend the practice. Se 2000 più nobili che in questa città vivono inseriti nei monasteri, but what would happen to 2,000 noble girls if they were not in convents? What confusion, what harm, what disorder, how dangerous, those scandals and terrible consequences we would see for the families, for the city, how it would result in indecency and disturb the public peace. A tidbit of popular culture reveals how the widespread practice of encloistering young girls was an accepted yet problematic social phenomenon. In a comical little song written in the early 16th century, it's about 100 years or so, a little less than 100 years or so, for a wedding of two nobles, we see a seemingly lighthearted joking about this pervasive practice. The poem was clear acknowledgement of the popular leitmotif of forced monetization, presented in this unusual form that's called the nun's joke, which pokes fun at the sad social structure. Ironically, and I think sardonically, since the poem was presented at the wedding of a daughter who was fortunate enough to escape incarceration, to which unfortunate, unlucky daughters fell victim. Monicelli incarcerati, siamo stati già molti anni, per uscire di tanti affanni, siamo al secolo ritornati. Imprisoned little nuns, we've now been for so many years. To get away from so many woes, we've returned to the world. The ballad continues to recount the story of the young nuns who escaped from the convent and returned to the world, only to be rejected once again by their families, who, as the song goes, treated them as mortal enemies. The song continues to tell how, locked up in their cells, the little nuns, all naked, look at their white and beautiful bodies, lamenting how wonderful it must be to follow the holy dictum to go forth and multiply. The lyrical ballad ends with the escaped nuns professing their commitment to be strong, to take on the filthiest of work rather than return to the convent. We are determined to live joyful lives with husband in this world. You can help us with a dowry. Tarabotti bitterly asks, how can you inflict such torture on your own flesh and blood? And in this apostrophe to fathers, she focuses on the patriarch of the family, who possessed legal power over his wife and children, originating from the Roman law, patria potestas. Although the family patriarch wielded the power to banish his daughters to the convent, he had help and collaboration, without which the practice of forced monetization couldn't thrive. Through verbal persuasion, rather than physical violence, the Venetian father, along with his collaborators, employed perfidious arguments to convince little girls, as Tarabotti terms it, to close herself in a cage. Tarabotti begins her argument against religious superiors, fearing that her pen is flying too boldly, citing these superiors as accomplices to the very deeds of the fathers. From Inferno, which is convent hell, she writes, this is from convent hell, the elderly nuns, who in turn had been tricked and deceived by their own family, now get their revenge. Tarabotti asserts that convents are run by prioresses and abbesses who, although dressed in nuns' habits, were not called by the Holy Spirit, but instead forced into the convent. By the time Arcangela had taken her vows, there had existed, for over half a century, church mandates prohibiting forced monetization and requiring that all female professans be interrogated by church elders to certify that they were taking vows voluntarily and that they clearly understood the commitment. These decrees were difficult to institute, even though it was forbidden, for example, for anyone to force a woman into a convent or deny a woman the right to enter. The subtleties inherent in coerced monetization of young girls could expediently be ignored, as would another edict denying eligibility to women with chronic sicknesses, mental infirmities, or physical handicaps. In Inferno Monicale, Tarabotti decries the practice of offering to Christ not their most beautiful and virtuous daughters, but instead the most repulsive and deformed, lame, hunchback, crippled, or simple-minded, blaming these creatures for the defects they were born with, and therefore relegating them to lifelong prison. The circumspect and insidious machination employed by families to coerce unwitting children to live in clausura were difficult to detect and regulate, especially with the cooperation and collaboration of convents and professed nuns. Tarabotti describes how the trickery begins with the father of the family. His decision churns the wheels of the ensuing chicanery. Once the decision is taken to cloister the child, a series of sweet persuasions is put into motion, as Tarabotti points out, to knowingly deceive the girls. The young girls are tricked and betrayed before they are of age to decide for themselves what kind of life is best for them. Their parents send them to the convent before they are even aware of where they are to be imprisoned. Oh, what a betrayal. Tarabotti reveals just how far the elderly nuns would go, often in collaboration with the girls' cloistered aunts. How far they would go to dupe the little girls. They would hang sugared almonds and candied fruits on the trees of the convent courtyard to create a terrestrial paradise, and con the children into believing there was wonderful magic in the nunnery gardens. And I must say, just as an aside, when I read this in her original language, I had to stop for a minute. I really had to stop and breathe in. It just seems so cruel to treat children that way, not to spank them or hit them or physically force them, but to do it that way. So that's my comment. Arcangela's comments, as she wrote again in Inferno, the old aunts tell such fabulous stories to their little nieces that even the most famous and gifted poets could not rival their art of persuasion to convince the girls to take the veil. Beginning with both mother and father ostensibly agreeing on which girl, as Tarabotti put it, will live in the light of the world and which other would be miserably enclosed, the stealthy coercion begins. Arcangela bitterly asks, with what heart do you think that the one girl child sees the other sister destined to be physically married and to revel in the delights and triumphs in the midst of luxury and grandeur? Tarabotti continues to present an emotional account of this hypothetical secular life of the, so to speak, lucky sister, pointing out the rough and ugly garments of the unfortunate sister. The unfortunate sister not even being allowed to keep her God-given natural hair. Passionately outraged, Tarabotti, our discarded daughter, asks, how can it be that 4 or 5 little girls, all from the same seed, birthed from the same womb, are given such different treatment? The collusion, however, wasn't limited to the cooperation of family members and conspiring nuns. The benefit of the state, ragion di Stato, the ultimate good for Venice, resided in maintaining a pure ruling class, an oligarchy that had sustained Venice's independence for over 1,000 years. The Doge, the Patriarch, the Council of Ten must deal with threats to stability presented by contaminating the caste, which would alter the composition of the ruling class. Tarabotti eloquently conflated societal practices and political utility that put the defense, conservation, and expansion of the state above every other consideration. But distinguishing her work specifically is her ability to thematize gender injustice through an acute awareness of the political underpinnings of unequal treatment of women. Obviously, to Tarabotti, the myth of Venice was just that, a political and social construction which relied on incarcerating a large part of its population. Venetian convents were filled with patrician upper-class noble girls and women. Noble families could boast of boarding their daughters in one of the many female religious houses noted for their aristocratic occupants. Within these confines, we see a microcosm, or better yet, a continuation of the secular society without. Class stratification penetrated the convent walls. For example, choir nuns were of noble birth, and their dowry payments, that is the spiritual dowry, to the convent were set high as to exclude most other women. The social divisions that existed without continued uninterrupted within, reinforcing close ties between convents and Venetian nobility, resulting in a symbiotic relationship which supported the political and social concerns of the Republic and which would prove impervious to change. So much so that Venetian convents have not abided by the mandates included in the reforms of the Council of Trent, which was held in response to the Protestant Reformation and significant changes in the confessional map of Europe between 1545 and 1563. These reforms and dictates, the reforms and dictates of this council, are referred to as the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. And particularly in Venice, noted for its liberal treatment of nuns and having acquired a reputation for scandal, ecclesiastical and state authorities instigated rigid surveillance policies focusing on monastic enclosure, prohibiting nuns from stepping out of the convent in order to secure their total encloisterment, complete separation from the secular world. Such structural modifications as barring windows and making them smaller, installing doors that locked from the outside, as well as raising the heights of peripheral walls, would keep the nun inside. Other restrictions pertaining to control over reading material and visitors would keep the women free of contamination from the outside world. Nuns resisted fiercely. Only gradually did some of the reforms take hold in a pervasive atmosphere of tension between enclosure and more open convents. In spite of these Tridentine clausura reforms, a half a century before Tarabotti was born, convent walls were breached from within and without. Defying mandates wrought to ensure total disjunction, the patrician and upper-class inhabitants of Venetian convents continued to intermingle, albeit from behind the finestrina, the little window, barred little window, with visitors coming into the Parlatorio, the reception room of the convent, a liminal space providing the cloistered women with a nexus between enclosure and the outside world. Here, Arcangela could discuss public affairs, exchange manuscripts, receive prohibited books, and meet with literati establishing social networks, threads of contacts reinforced and further enhanced through her letter exchanges with allies and patrons essential to the nuns' publication goal. Indeed, the Parlatorio became a sort of salon for Suor Tarabotti. Among a formidable array of notable visitors was Arcangela's brother-in-law, Giovan Pighetti, married to the nun's youngest sister, Lorenzina. Pighetti, impressed with the nun's courageous writing, became an early supporter, lent her books, looked at manuscripts, and eventually introduced his sister-in-law to Giovan Francesco Loredan, eminent noble and founder of the celebrated Accademia degli Incogniti, of which Pighetti was a member. This Accademia was an elite, quasi-secret cultural society that had members who were classically educated, ardently patriotic, many quite libertine in thought, most belonging to the patrician ruling class. Anti-clerical and liberal in their social views, these free-thinking intellectuals were intrigued by the outspoken Benedictine nun. Loredan, controlling the Venetian press in mid-Seicento Venice, would eventually circulate and facilitate publication of Tarabotti's manuscripts. Paradiso Monicali, that is, convent paradise, the first to press in 1643 when the nun was 39 years old. A little bit about Convent Paradise. It's not the first book that she wrote. She wrote the other two first, but she wanted to publish, and so she wrote Convent Paradise, which it wasn't going back on what she thought. It just acknowledged the idea that the convent could be a paradise to those with a calling. However, those without, it was not. So with that out, she was able, Loredan was able to publish it.
When were they published?
Excuse me?
Approximately when was she doing this publishing?
During the, well, this was published in 1643.
Oh.
Yeah, she was born in the early part of the 17th century, in 1604. So she was 39 years old when this was published. From her subaltern state, Arcangela, in order to distinguish herself as a woman of letters, legitimize her intellectual worth, and concretize her writerly identity, would continually be at the mercy of the mighty. Oftentimes, the catalysts of the nuns' expedient associations originated from within Sant'Anna Convent itself. For example, Arcangela's strong friendship with her consorella Betta Polani enabled the nun to establish a concatenation of acquaintances which eventually led to the powerful Loredan, to whom she would pass on a copy of her Paradiso, Convent Paradise. This sort of value chain was one of the few strategic avenues open to a woman with literary ambition, constricted and constrained by walls, dictums, and religious rigors. Although Arcangela was firmly confined to the convent in these Tridentine times, she took full advantage of the social space of the Parlatorio, which was hardly the sedate and solemn sphere authorities would have preferred. To the contrary, 17th century Venetian parlatorios functioned as civic centers where marriage negotiations took place, bridal parties visited enclosed relatives, and music, dance, and dramatic performances attracted a well-heeled crowd. This osmotic link, the junction between convent confinement and secular social spaces, offered Arcangela the possibility of mastering at least a portion of her circumscribed condition. We see, for example, in her correspondence with the unidentified, the most illustrious Countess S., for example, Tarabotti taking the reins to organize a concert at the convent. She invites the Countess, who was also a singer, to perform at Sant'Anna lunedì prossimo, next Monday. The missive chronicles the nun's enterprising spirit as she organizes a Parlatorio concert. Venetian convents, housing the better part of the city's patrician women, resisted all attempts by state and ecclesiastical authorities to be severed from secular society. The convent and the Parlatorio, notwithstanding chronic tension between strict enclosure and more open secular female religious homes, were tightly woven into the social, political, and economic fabric of 17th century Venice. Considering Arcangela Tarabotti's life and letters was lived within the strict enclosure of the convent of Sant'Anna in Venice, we marvel at the perspicacity and intrepid resolve of this woman who, predominantly through her epistological, that is her letter writing, relationships, succeeded in establishing a far-flung network of correspondence and in gaining the support of the most powerful literary, political, and religious figures of the day. Through her persistent and arduous networking, Arcangela Tarabotti, at the time of her death in 1652, had published 4 texts. Sometimes they say 5, but actually one small text was published within another one, so I say 4. Her letter volume, which we call Lettere Familiari e di Complimento, Letters Familiar and Formal, published in 1650, reveals to the world and exemplifies the nun's literary skills as she displays her talents. Tarabotti's letters not only make public the nun's talent and temperament, but also bring to light sophisticated strategies of self-representation as the author carefully chronicles the trajectory of her literary career. Suor Arcangela is clearly in the business of identity construction, affirming and defending her intellectual honesty and literary worth in this auto-edited and selectioned collection of formal and informal missives. Inextricably entwined in Tarabotti's self-defense and self-assertion in lettere, we have a narrative discourse, a dialogic that lays bare the enterprising nun's relentless drive to have her offspring, as she herself referenced her literary production, come to life in print. She takes full advantage of the epistolary genre and convent conventions, capitalizing on available structures in order to gain her coveted place in the res publica literarum, or the literary world of Venice and beyond. This is a list of her texts, and the ones in yellow are the ones that I referred to. And as you see, the two most scathing texts, and perhaps her best, Tirania Paterna, was published posthumously. And as you see, it had a name change. That is, that paternal tyranny, which means the same thing in Italian, was a little too much at the time. And so they changed the title, this is after her death anyway, Simplicità ingannata, that is, innocence deceived, which was, it was better. I mean, even though it was published in Holland, it was still better than paternal tyranny, you know, at the time. Okay, so that's the list of her works. Well fortified with her sword, as she referred to her pen, which she brandishes, telling us, già che non posso le spade per difendere il mio sesso, I do not have a sword to defend my sex. Suor Tarabotti, from the time she realized her intellectual capacities and began putting pen to paper, gave purpose to her life, albeit not the vocation that had been thrust upon her as an 11-year-old child, cast away into the convent by her father, who saw dismal marriage prospects for his slightly lame firstborn. We have scarce knowledge of Tarabotti's time in Sant'Anna from 1623, when she took her final vows, until 1639. We know during the years preceding the publication of Paradiso that Tarabotti had become an accomplished autodidact, able to reference such authors as Boccaccio, Petrarch, Ariosto, Dante, whose texts she would have devoured in an effort to compensate for the lacuna of education she often laments and often refers to, but never allows to impede her literary ambitions. So Arcangela, from 1639 on, became engaged in stalwart combat to publish and ceaseless struggle to assert and defend her literary integrity. And along this sinuous route to publication, she had to cope with supporters who would become detractors. With attentively cultivated relationships that would end in disappointing disloyalty. However, driven by her commitment to exposing patriarchal dominance that deprived women, as she put it, of their God-given rights, and backed by adamant pride in her own writing, Tarabotti was relentless in her efforts to gain widespread readership, and not at all reticent to upbraid those who put obstacles in the path of her publication agenda. We see an example of self-assertion in the progression of Tarabotti's letters to the Marchese di Galleranda. The nun's first letter begs the nobleman to take copies of Tirania Paterna, Paternal Tyranny, and Inferno Monacale, Convent Hell, with her to Paris, where the anti-clerical environment might be more receptive to publication of these contentious works. Tarabotti becomes steadily more ascetic in her correspondence. When she hadn't heard from the Marchioness in over a year and had gotten word that the noblewoman's secretary intended to publish Tirania in his own name, she writes to the Marchioness. Finally, after so long, you have inquired, se sono vivo o morto, if I am dead or alive. Thank God I am very much alive and ready to fight against anyone who attempts to trick me. Instead, anyone who tries to defraud me, will he himself be defrauded? Doubly marginalized, first as a woman and then as a cloistered nun, to prevail as a writer of polemic works, Tarabotti had to take the offensive, openly soliciting support from those in power. By the same token, when put on the defensive, Arcangela clearly showed herself more than capable of asserting her will and safeguarding her literary standing. There's nothing confessional or overtly autobiographical in her work. However, behind Arcangela's biting words, we cannot help but see the psychological torture this discarded daughter must have endured, the fury she must have felt, unloved and abandoned to the convent. Her mordant metaphors dispatched zealously attest to the underlying outrage, but Tarabotti adroitly channels her own emotions into acute denunciations of the inherent causes driving the perpetuation of a despicable system. Her Dantesque allusion describes the situation of the young girls condemned to a perpetual labyrinth of the cloister. I found it astonishing that Tarabotti would go on describing in detail how the hypothetical lucky daughter is prepared for her actual marriage, for a physical marriage. For her dress, the most precious pearls from the Orient are sent for, to wear around her neck, and big shiny diamonds in the shape of flowering roses will be placed on her finger. Carefully crafted gold will hang from her ears. There's no luxury, delight, or extravagance too superfluous or too grand for the terrestrial bride. Instead, the other girl, the one buried in the tomb of the convent, must cover her legs with rough cloth, and she has to get used to wearing poorly lined wooden clogs on her feet. Around her neck, she has to wear a bib, so unflattering that all of her natural God-given gifts are hidden. Oh, what unjust partiality. Arcangela fought back with her unchaste words and succeeded in turning her soul-wrenching, heartbreaking abandonment and confinement into self-realization, fulfilling what had become her real vocation, tapping into her inherent talents and channeling her anger, defining its source, and then broadening what could have been a personal story into a treatise defending all women.